Ronan suddenly walked into the room from the window, causing Professor Varren to be terrified, clutching his dream bird and screaming loudly, "Who are you? How did you get in here? This is one of the highest floors." The scream made Ronan a little uncomfortable. He held a feather in his hand, scratched his ear and exclaimed, "He scared me to death. I thought I was going deaf." Acel also rode in from the window, feeling a little guilty. Voice: "That's why I said take the stairs." The dream bird Marpe was still extremely scared and snuggled into Professor Varren's arms. He patted and reassured it and then let out a loud snort and shouted, "Are you following my Marpe?" Ronan saw that this person still doubted him, so he raised the green feather in his hand. Professor Varren saw this hair and his eyes widened, as if remembering something. He looked back at the two people who had just climbed into his room's window and exclaimed, "These are the saviors who freed my baby." Warm light shone into the room through the window. Professor Varren quickly said, "Oh my God, I'm so rude in front of my benefactor." After the misunderstanding was cleared, Professor Varren quickly invited Ronan and the two to sit down in a chair. He was very embarrassed that he had misunderstood them. He continued to apologize, hoping that they would forgive him. When Ronan heard that, he immediately refused. Said patiently, "I said it's okay, why do you keep repeating it?" Ronan looked at Dreambird and continued, "If you want to be clear, it's his fault, he climbed out the window on his own." Acel sat next to him and heard him say that, confused and silently said, It's him, he told me. Using remote control because I find taking the stairs annoying is Ronan." Seeing that Acel was talking too much, Ronan quickly reached out and squeezed her mouth, warning and speaking in an orderly manner. His ears were quiet. Ronan observed Professor Varren for a moment and then continued, "The important thing is that I couldn't imagine that a sphinx, an extremely rare demi-human, was the owner of that bird, and I'm also a professor at Philion." The dream bird had calmed down now. It was leisurely perching on Professor Varren's shoulder. He heard Ronan say that and helplessly smiled and said, "I was also very surprised. I didn't expect our hero to be candidates taking the exam at this academy." Professor Varren felt a bit guilty and continued to say, "It's so embarrassing. If I knew in advance I would have written a letter of recommendation for you. But today is exam day. I hope that doesn't happen. But what if you fail?" Hearing this, Ronan whispered, thinking why would he say those bad words. He immediately spoke up to interrupt Professor Varren. "Oh, it's okay. We just came here to ask something. You know, we don't have plenty of time." Stop for a moment. He opened his hand holding the bird egg, asked suspiciously, "What is this? That blue bird gave birth to it." Professor Varren was extremely surprised when he saw it. He immediately adjusting the frames of my glasses to see more clearly. "I couldn't believe it. What did Marpe give birth to?" Noran brought his hand closer for the professor to see more clearly. In his hand, the sparkling purple bird's egg lay neatly. Professor Varren quickly picked up the egg to look at it and then asked Noran again, "Did you say Marpe gave birth to it?" Seeing Professor Varren's questioning expression, Noran shrugged and replied, "So what about birds laying eggs? Anything surprising?" Professor Varren's face was sweating. He frowned and said, "This is not just an ordinary blue bird, it is a dream bird, but what is even more surprising is that." He raised his hand holding the egg and said worriedly, "I don't know what will hatch from this egg." Hearing that, Ronan crossed his arms and said in confusion, "What are you talking about? If it's a bird egg, it will give birth to a bird, right?" "What child?" Professor Varren shook his head and said, "Dream birds are different." He looked intently at the egg and then began to explain, "Depending on the surrounding environment, the dream bird will absorb unique mana and then lay eggs. If there is lava around, the egg will hatch into a fiery phoenix. If it is in a monster's nest, the dream bird that is born will have the shape of that monster, and there are also cases where the thing that hatches from the egg does not have the shape of a bird at all." Professor Varren put the egg on the table and said worriedly, "Of course, if I analyze the mana emitted from that egg, predicting the shape of the dream bird in that egg is not impossible. But this egg," Professor Varren caressed it and continued, "carries many mixed mana fields, like smelting an alloy, they melt and mix together. It's so embarrassing, but now it's very difficult to dare." "Sure. What is this egg?" Noran saw that he was so worried, even sitting on one side was sweating, so he spoke up to reassure him, "Oh my God, with only one egg he put so much thought into it." Professor Varren didn't pay attention to Noran's words. He turned to blame the dream bird sitting on his shoulder. "This scoundrel, where did you wander off to lay this egg?" The dream bird showed its appearance. Innocently chirped. Noran saw a bird like that and said with disgust, "I have never met a bird with such a thick face." Professor Varren, sitting opposite, quickly clasped his hands together and said a little cautiously, "So I ask you to take care of him. Can you care for this egg?" Noran heard that and was extremely surprised. He let out a sigh and nodded and said, "Well, actually, I don't have any problem." Seeing that Ronan agreed, Professor Varren happily said, "This egg is extremely precious. A dream bird can only give birth once in its entire life." He turned his head to look at the dream bird affectionately. But if it had laid this egg in front of its benefactor, Marpe must have sensed something special. Professor Varren continued to speak softly. I also want to respect my friend who has been with me for a long time, so I will give this egg to you. The dream bird seemed to understand what its master meant. It happily bounced. Tickles on his back, constantly chirping. Holding the egg in his hand, Ronan bowed his head to look at it and then comfortably replied, no problem, I'm also curious about what will come out of this shell. Having said this, Ronan immediately stuffed the egg carefully into his pocket. Realizing that the time was running out, he and the cell stood up, looked at Professor Varren and said goodbye. Everything was done. Please excuse us, Professor. Monk Varren saw that Ronan wanted to leave and quickly reached out his hand and said, wait a minute. All this time he had been thinking about what to give Ronan. Then he remembered something very interesting, so he quickly stood up and ran to find it. Very soon Professor Varren returned. He handed a slightly crumpled and old scroll to Ronan. Seeing this, both of them were confused, not knowing what this was. A moment later, at the practical examination hall, the Galilean Palace. Inside the waiting room, countless candidates were present, filling all the rows of waiting chairs. The atmosphere here is very urgent. Candidates constantly pray for themselves to smoothly pass this test. The contest secretary entered the waiting room and loudly announced that candidate number 111 had completed the test. After announcing, he continued to shout loudly, please invite candidate number 112. The candidate whose name was called seemed very nervous. His face drenched in sweat quickly stood up, his voice trembling, and he replied, yes, yes. He quickly entered the room with a worried mind. The exam room door gradually closed behind him. Ronan was sitting on the side looking at the back of candidate 112 thinking, 112 already, next is me. He sat cross-legged, resting one hand on his chin and groaning. They waited for a long time. Complaining a few words, Ronan turned around and asked Maria sitting next to her, did she see that? Maria didn't even glance at her. She crossed her arms and calmly said, it's not like that. Seeing Maria wearing a very serious face, Ronan asked in confusion, why are you wearing that outfit? Don't you feel uncomfortable? Maria heard that and immediately smiled faintly and replied, I did it on purpose. Philion is an academy. Private property of all nobles. After saying that, she put her hand on Ronan's shoulder, winking with excitement. In the future there will be top guests, so of course I shouldn't be sloppy, right? Ronan was speechless hearing that. This girl is right. That's very thoughtful. Leaning back in the chair, Maria lamented, it would be nice to have our baby here. What a pity. Ronan nodded in response. Who knows what to do? The magic exam hall is somewhere else. He didn't cry. That's why I'm happy. Having just said this, the door of the exam room opened again. Candidate number 112 walked out disappointedly. It looked like it was broken. The secretary following behind shouted loudly, candidate number 112 had completed the test. Next please invite candidate number 113. Ronan heard it was his turn and stood up. Maria was next to her and gently encouraged her, don't worry, just do your best as I told you. Seeing that he was almost entering the exam room, Maria suddenly called out, if you fail, I won't leave it alone. Ronan heard that and waved his hand and said, I know, thank you for your enthusiastic support. Just a few more steps to go through the door. Ronan firmly grasped the sword in his hand. He turned his head slightly and confidently said, I'll be back later. Stepping inside, Ronan's eyes suddenly opened wide. Philion's 5 professors were sitting there seriously. Ronan looked intently at the 5 people in front of him. His eyes were bright and full of confidence. Looking at these 5 people, Ronan silently assessed that they all looked very outstanding. But among the 5 people here, Ronan's eyes focused on the old man sitting in the middle. He was the principal of Philion Academy, the great magician Krava Kratir. The woman sitting next to this old man also exuded an overwhelming aura. In his past life, Ronan had rarely felt as pressured as he was now. This woman was a sword instructor, the great sword St. Nabarose. Looking around, Ronan immediately bowed low and politely said, I'm Ronan. The principal immediately spoke up, nice to meet you Ronan. I'm the principal of Philion Academy, Krava Kratir. He pointed to one direction and said, you will fight a magic doll, so you can show off your techniques. Have you decided what moves you will show us? Hear him say that the pastor stared at the doll in front of him then nodded and said, oh yes, nothing special. He placed his hand on the hilt of the sword, bowed his head slightly so his expression could not be seen clearly, confidently continued, it was just a quick sword strike, I think that was enough. Principal Krava Kratir heard that and huffed but said nothing. A teacher sitting next to him stroked his beard and said, a simple slash that doesn't require mana. This teacher turned around and whispered to another teacher next to him, there wasn't such a candidate just now, they just evaluated the appearance of the magic dolls and said those stupid things. The other person also nodded in agreement and said, well, if it was a contestant from a faraway country, he might not know. Although the doll placed in front of him looks simple, it has the defensive ability to overcome aura, and can recover very quickly. It is a sophisticated product of magic. The two teachers were still whispering in each other's ears. Even the sword of some genius Schlieffen didn't leave any traces. I wonder what trick this guy is going to show us. Who knows? What if he tears it? How about double it? The principal sitting in the middle heard all these words. He looked towards the other two teachers and thought, he was right in front of them and they still said such offensive words. He thought about this, his eyebrows furrowed together, a little worried. What if this child could prove them wrong? Principal Kraver put those thoughts out of his head and focused on observing the move that Ronan was about to use. Ronan's face exuded a steadfast and confident look. How could such a young person have this kind of courage? A sword that Ronan slashed carried terrible power, slashing straight at the magic doll's head. When the great swordsman Nabarose saw this move, he was stunned and seemed very surprised. After performing this move, Ronan didn't show anything but quickly retracted his sword and took a step back. He looked at the 5 people sitting next to him and nodded and said, "I'm done." The 2 teachers from earlier were the first to speak. Ha ha, oh my god, I didn't expect that it would only take one sword strike. The grading of this exam is a bit vague. The person sitting next to him turned to ask the principal, "Do you think so?" Principal Kraver did not answer this question. He was still gaping motionless on the spot. His eyes opened wide, his surprised face began to be covered with sweat. Before he could react, the great swordsman Nabarose stepped on the table with one foot, making the surrounding professors extremely frightened. Her eyes were bloodshot, she pulled out her sword and rushed towards where Ronan was standing. Nabarose's body exuded a terrifying oppressive aura. She coldly placed the sharp blade on Ronan's neck. The storm began to rise in this small room. Ronan still stood there calmly, without the slightest fear. Looking at the sharp blade on his neck, Ronan frowned and said, "Are you threatening me?" Nabarose's eyes exuded a cold light. She asked seriously, "Who are you? That sword technique, who taught you?" Ronan didn't understand what the other person meant when he asked him who he learned the sword from. The other person didn't explain but asked him another question. "Did you see my sword?" Ronan nodded and expressed appreciation. Her swordsmanship is truly superb. Drawing the sword suddenly like that is very difficult. Yet she swung her sword 3 times. At his answer, Nabarose's attitude suddenly became unpleasant. "It's true, Dad, just like what you showed us, that arrogant sword slash of yours." Her words made Ronan human. His bewildered appearance made Nabarose even angrier, she thought during the fight earlier. When he performed the slash on the doll, he deliberately cut the last stroke very slowly to prevent them from seeing clearly. That action officially angered the opponent. She warned loudly, "Have you forgotten where you are?" The principal was speechless and did not dare to speak. Other professors also harbored doubts. Ronan realized that she had misunderstood him. He was just adjusting his hand strength because he thought that the sword would not be able to block the final slash. But when she saw the other person's angry expression, maybe if he said anything, she wouldn't believe it. A moment later, Nabarose slowly lifted the sword away from Ronan's neck. This action of hers made Ronan suspicious. He did not expect that the other person would just forgive him like that, but he immediately regretted it. Before leaving, Nabarose warned that he would definitely teach him again. The principal quietly looked at Nabarose and considered. With her challenge, she will probably accept Ronan as her disciple. So he needed to pay more attention. Then he turned around and said to Ronan, "Good job, Ronan. Then we will end today's test with an open-ended question and answer, so just say what you think makes the most sense. What do you want to learn when you go to Philion Academy?" Ronan asked himself how he should answer that question. Until he remembered his dead comrades. So that you don't have to regret it again. That was the first thing he wanted to learn. The principal's eyes seemed stunned when he knew his goal. He seemed to understand and then allowed Ronan to go out. The hall door slowly closed. The principal still hasn't recovered from Ronan's answer. How can he not regret it? "It's really troublesome. I don't know how I should teach that boy. His state makes the professor next to me confused. What's going on?" First Professor Nabarose and now the principal too. What did that boy do that caused the two of them to end up like this? Did he use any clever tricks? The principal immediately looked at the doll. Using tricks. That's a good way to explain it. Actually, maybe we should call him Kai Tai. As soon as he finished speaking, the doll's head split in half. The professors gasped. They didn't expect what happened to the magic doll. Its head fell to the ground. And the person who made it all happen was still lounging outside the door. He thought of Nabarose's sword from earlier. Even in his previous life, he was not sure of victory. Perhaps he has truly met a worthy opponent, but it seems like the road is still very long. And that's a good first step to the academy. If you stay here, you will definitely learn a lot of things. Right now there's only the written test left. He's been able to remember it all this month. Therefore, you can confidently consider this final exam to be easy. However, after finishing the exam, Ronan's emotions sank. Hopeless, he must have regretted crowing so loudly. The feeling of depression increasingly surrounds Ronan. Maria turned to ask Asel in confusion. She didn't expect him to not be able to complete even half of the lesson. Why is that? I remember telling him to look at what was in his bag. Hearing that, Asel hesitated. Because Ronan took his things to take to school and then put his bag somewhere else. Because he was so focused, he forgot his bag. Asel was extremely regretful. He blamed himself. It was me. If I had reminded him, things wouldn't have turned out like this. Maria standing next to her was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't believe that such a stupid person still existed. Okay, she turned to ask, so since the test ended, he's been like this forever, when will the results come out? After a while, Maria went to cheer Ronan up and said, I know, don't frown anymore, the practice is still more important, it's okay, with your skills, I'm sure. While comforting me, a practitioner nearby said in panic, look, the results are here. Immediately after that, the announcement list appears. Maria and Asel walked over nervously. They didn't think there would be results so quickly. Asel ranked 12th in practice, 1st in theory. Maria of the martial arts department ranked 9th in practice, 9th in theory. Just after seeing the results, the two turned to look at each other. Maria couldn't hold back her joy. She hugged Asel's neck and was happy. We passed. Asel, you even took the theory test. You got first place. Asel couldn't believe your results. Even though there are two people with the same rank as Asel. But it was still first class. Maria was extremely excited and patted his head. Asel shyly said it was just luck. At that moment, Maria remembered Ronan and turned back to ask him what his rank was. But before her eyes was the teenager's collapsed appearance. He was extremely emaciated when he learned that his name was not on the board. Hearing him say that, the two were surprised. They couldn't believe that someone like Ronan couldn't get in. Have you looked carefully? This is impossible. Ronan let Maria torture him. He whispered, I read every name. I told you, I did really bad. I was still in despair. Then suddenly there was a loud explosion behind them. Ronan didn't understand what happened. Maria explained that it was a fireworks display for the valedictorian of the entrance exam. That explosion came from the fire phoenix. It waved its wings and flew in the air, then spit out a spot of light. This thing flew straight towards Ronan in his naivety. When the light was just approaching, the content inside was the valedictorian. This person was Ronan, with first place in practice and 5,712th in theory. All three of them were stunned for a long while. When they realized this truth, Maria and Asel rushed forward to hug Ronan tightly. Yet you are the valedictorian in martial arts. Very good, Ronan, you are the valedictorian. I knew you were a genius. I guess I have an eye for good people. While being happy, Ronan was stunned as if remembering something. If you ranked first, then it means he lost to you. With that character of the opponent, there is no way he will leave it alone. This is a bit strange. Not long after, the opponent also appeared, along with a gloomy state. So it was you, the one who placed first in the practical exam. As soon as he heard that voice, Ronan was stunned. He knew right away. Right? Encounter each other like this. The opponent slowly approached. This person is the sword St. Shiliefan.